I want to introduce our guests now. Also, before I do that, if you have any questions you'd like to pose to anyone in the course of the next half hour or so, please put them in the question and answer window of your control panel. Christine Turner is the producer and director of this incredible film, which was Oscar nominated. Actually, it won the NAACP Image Award, I believe. She is a veteran of film and television. She's a producer, a director, and a writer, and she does works with both fiction and nonfiction work. And it's my honor to welcome here tonight. Dr. Izetta Mobley is the Director of Interpretation, Collections, and Education at the Reginald Lewis Museum. Her research focuses on race, disability, slavery, public history, digital humanities, and material and visual culture. She also represents the Lewis Museum on the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it's an honor to have both of you with us tonight. So Christine, I really wanted to start with you first. First of all, I'm not sure if congratulations is the right word, but this is such an incredible, powerful film, and you're just to be complimented or lauded for this unbelievable accomplishment. What you've been able to convey in 15 minutes is pretty powerful. So, and that's really the first thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, you started with this collection of material and this history, and there are so many ways that you could have approached this. And I'm just wondering, what was your thought process in molding this material? You know, what was the story you wanted to tell?
First of all, thank you, Will, for having me. It's such an honor to be here tonight, to be able to screen the film, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I see that there's 176 participants, and it's overwhelming that so many people have tuned in to this screening and conversation. So thank you all for being here as well. There are many different thoughts that I had going into making this film. One of them was that it was important to me to tell a story about Black resistance and about Black agency, and not just a story about Black victimization. So that was very much on my mind throughout both the research process, the filming and editing, which is how I landed on, I think, focusing on the story of Jesse Washington in particular, and deciding to really highlight the work of Black activists who ultimately, you know, transformed and recontextualized these photographs and postcards and souvenirs to really fight against lynching. So that was just something that was important to me as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, really wanting to make sure that those kinds of stories and narratives get told within the context of this larger lynching history. The other thing is that, you know, the film is short, it's 15 minutes, and it's not intended to be exhaustive. You know, it's really looking at the history of lynching through very specifically, you know, this angle of postcards and photography. And I felt that that was an interesting way into the story, and that had been, I think, underexplored, in particular in documentary anyway. So, you know, there, at the time, you know, at the genesis of this project, it was sort of post, you know, the murder of George Floyd. But also, you know, I had been thinking a lot about Ahmaud Arbery's murder and the way in which that had been captured on video. So some of these modern day lynchings, felt like there were a lot of parallels. And although the film doesn't, I think, directly draw those parallels, I think indirectly it hopefully is there. So those were some of the things that were in mind as I approached the film.
You know, one of the more shocking points I think that was brought out was that how this was and a leisure activity. I mean, this is stunning. There are records of similarly in Maryland, in the last lynching in Maryland in 1933. They were estimated there were 5,000 people in the town that normally has 900, and that there were men and women and children who were, involved in this, horror.
Yeah, that was certainly something that grabbed my attention as well. And I think in the film, Dr. Terry Ann Scott talks about this idea of lynching and leisure, and lynching as a form of entertainment. I think that for many people, at least the way that I learned about it in history classes, lynching was kind of always depicted, and you'll see this on television and in films today, as this spontaneous event, where there were maybe a group of men who would go into the woods and they would get carried away and lynch someone, and we know, in fact, that many of these lynchings were planned events, where, as you just remarked, people came from out of town and they were advertised, and there would be trains sometimes to carry people in, and that hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of people would gather to attend and participate in these lynchings. And I felt like that was a really important thing to touch on in the film, because it speaks also, I think, as to the way that people formed a sense of community and identity as well, white identity, around these lynchings. And just the idea of I think that, children were brought to these events, right? And men and women participated. And as you commented, people from all social classes, is a really important point, right? It's not just those people. It's not just the Ku Klux Klan, for example, right? These are everyday, ordinary citizens, I think, which is really important to remember.
Dr. Mobley, I wanted to ask you about something about a point I thought was a really important point that was brought out. I think it was by Lee Rayford. She talked about how these photographs, extend time, right? And it allows the viewer, the holder of the postcard, as it were, to experience the power and control repeatedly, right, over and over. And I wanted to know if you could just speak to that a little bit, because obviously it would have been a source of gratification to whites, and at the same time as a source of terror and fear to Blacks.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this incredible film, Christina. That I saw Biko's name flash by as one of the readers. I went to school with him, went to college with him, and so I recognized the voice, and I said, "Wait a minute!" And then another Brown connection appeared with Marsha Chatelaine, Dr. Marsha Chatelaine, of course, Pulitzer Prize winner, who I know for a fact is giving a speech right now at the DC History Conference. So we're passing each other in the night. So I felt the deep anchoring of both history and arts in the way that you approached this film, and also in the thoughtfulness of who reads what, right? So how is the voice reimagined and repositioned and reframed? So thank you so much for that. I study photography in large part because I find the medium of both photography and film, both as a material object and as a part of visual culture, to deeply implicate some of the desires and history and dynamics, racial, sexual, who gets stared at, who is considered nominated and elected for bodily destruction, who is considered someone who you could possess. So I think that Dr. Rayford's point there about what scholars sometimes call temporality, or the way that time works, is very much present when one talks about film or photography. It's so inherent to the medium, the way time passes, or how we think about photography capturing an instant, or we can freeze that instant. And I think Dr. Rayford's point of the way in which those postcards and carte de visites, because this is the other thing about those postcards and cartes de visite, many of them are hand-sized. So you really are thinking about touching them and the possession of them, and that extending the possession of the Black body. And I thought that the film is so powerful because you're allowed to see the edges of each of those carte de visites, so that you understand that the carte de visite and the photographs and postcards are in fact material objects that are being passed around, used, mailed, right? Sent far and wide. And I think one of the things that this does for me is that as a historian, I see part of my work as being the destruction of historical fantasy of a nonviolent past, right? Like that is a historical fantasy that we have about how race worked in this country. And it is painful to untie ourselves from that fantasy. But part of this film is showing us the everydayness, the quotidianness with which the destruction of the Black body and the possession of it and the dispersal of it was normalized. And so that's what I think about with time, that it's the possession of the Black body through time, across time and space, and that even in our modern contemporary moment, that there are people 100 years gone from racial terror and lynching, and their images still circulate. And what must that be like to be forever captured in that way?
I think, you know, one of the aspects of having these circulate also was, and someone brought this up in the film, was that it widened the community, right? That took part. It normalized the behavior. It validated it in a way. I couldn't stop thinking of, you know, something I used to do when my kids were young, you know, go get the mail, go bring the mail in, and just imagining what that would be like to have a child bring in a postcard like this. How can one explain that, the acceptance of that kind of horror?
Mm. Well, I don't want to assume something that we call in history presenteeism, which is the assumption that how we view things now, or the parallels or metaphors that we might make to our contemporary moment, is the same as there is to the past. I will say that every day in this country, we live with mass violence through gun violence, and we think about how that might be normalized. I will say that we're living through a mass pandemic, which is probably the largest disabling moment in history. I will say that we've seen these moments of George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery, or I could go on and on and on, of these captured by our cameras. Like, it's very similar that in the documentary, there's that conversation about Kodak creates this sort of personal camera in the late 19th century, and that allows, frequently historians talk about the democratization of photography, and that is happening at a level again with the kind of high quality film that you're able, and filmmaking, because these are actually films, right? To a certain degree, they're not just photographs, but they have a filmic quality to them, that people are capturing of Black death, from Michael Brown to Eric Garner to George Floyd. So I wonder if we would like to think that people were horrified, but one of the deeper terrors to realize is how normalized this was and how acceptable it was. And that to me is actually just as terrifying as many of those images, that it was so normalized that it was considered acceptable and people didn't even glance at the violence of it.
There's some irony, I think, as well, that the in these images that we saw, these were celebrating this kind of violence, and now, thank goodness for these iPhones and you know, cameras and phones that we have that can gather evidence. It's kind of been used in a different way. I'm wondering, Christine, do you know of any other instance, you know, in the world or in history where memorializing this kind of brutality was so common or accepted? I couldn't think of any, you know, cognate in you know, either in the Nazis or any other kind of brutality that we know of that's recorded, where these kinds of images or were celebrated in this way.
A really good question. I am not a historian, but I think we should ask Dr. Mobley, who is a visual culture scholar, because this is probably something she is more aware of.
So I constantly think about King Leopold's War in Central Africa, which is often documented. If it might be difficult to find in the US, but many British libraries, for instance, have full collections. If you're thinking about Indigenous people. So I should step back a few steps and say, let's talk about photography, right? Because we're 200 years almost into this. So right, photography and film is naturalized to us, but photography isn't created until approximately 1839. There's a fight between these two French folks, Nespis and Daguerre. Daguerre wins, which is why you hear about daguerreotypes. And then from there you get into film. But race is originally implicated, and racism is originally implicated in photography and film. Everything from the lighting used, right? So the literal medium is not used to consider brown skin, right? It's not used. So even as a filmmaker, I'm sure, Christine, you know, you have to do all types of lighting tricks. One of Oprah Winfrey's patents actually is a patent around an adjustment to film material to properly capture her skin tone with white guests, because cameras are usually not developed in that way. And that photography from when it's invented in 1839 is used to determine things like phrenology, right? So looking at the shape of people's heads to determine their race and their ability to think. If we think about, there are a series of daguerreotypes that have recently made news at Harvard.
Yes.
Yes, because of the Renti, Delia, et cetera, these very famous daguerreotypes, which were tiny, they were handheld, and have been blown up and dispersed. Those were racial studies, right? Photography was used for racial studies, for Indigenous people, for Black folk, for Asian folks, and particularly thinking about immigration photography in the 19th and early 20th century. So photography and race and film and race are deeply linked. Like everyone talks about this D.W. Griffith, and many people know his most infamous sort of film about race, but many people don't know he does a film both about Black people and then a film called Broken Blossoms, ostensibly about Chinese folks and racialized folks. So race and film and photography are intricately linked, and photography is often used to reinforce through the visual who is a dominant person eligible for life and who is not.
Karen asked, and I'm not sure if Christina, you might know this, whether or not any attempts were ever made to identify some of the onlookers in these.
It wasn't something that I pursued, you know, for this film, or that I was necessarily interested in. I'm not aware of necessarily who's done the work to track people down, but I'm certain that there are people's grandchildren in there, and that there are some very familiar faces that have been identified. Sometimes I'm asked, you know, did you ever think to interview, you know, try and find those people or interview them? But not really. I wasn't so interested in hearing that perspective. You know, I wanted to hear the perspectives of people in the Black community and sort of understand what their take and what their reading on this history was. But Dr. Mobley, I'm glad that you pointed out earlier that you were able to observe the materiality of these images, because that was really important to me, right? That the audience understood that these were physical objects that were collected, and that they were souvenirs. And in some images you'll see there are still fingerprint smudges, you know, which just speaks to this is a physical piece of history that people had. And also to your point, you know, the idea that this was an everyday occurrence and that it was quotidian in that sense was important. I think that, Will, when you were speaking earlier about like some of the horror or that you both were talking about is just the horror that maybe this wasn't horrific to some people. I think it's really interesting. And one of the things, that I think speaks to that is actually just the handwritten messages on the back. I often find those to be just as chilling and just as memorable as the images themselves. When the young man refers to the lynching as, a barbecue, and he's writing this postcard to his parents and expressing a sense of pride, that is something that it was seared in my mind, that I had seen previous to, making this film and had remembered. So I think also it's the imagery, but also the writing and the way that the lynchings were talked about. That's equally important.
Christine, I was so curious also about how your own looking evolved, like from when you first sort of saw these images and decided which ones to select. How did your own looking evolve?
It's a really interesting question. I first came across some of these images, over 2 decades ago, around the time that the Without Sanctuary collection came out. And just as working as an archival researcher, I'd seen them over the years for other kinds of projects, and I hadn't seen them discussed specifically in a project, but I'd seen those images used to talk about lynching more generally. So I was familiar with some of them, but of course, in the process of making this film, along with Rosemary Rotundi, who's a wonderful archival researcher, we were able to collect and amass more material. And I think that, for me, initially, it's, taking in those images is a difficult thing, but in a way, you almost have to put them aside to do the work, to craft the story. And then it isn't until it all comes together again that now it has new meaning and new context, and it affected me in an entirely different way. So there's at different moments a different feeling. And sometimes I find that it is sitting in a dark theater, which I did for the first time not that long ago here in New York, that I really could, forget that I was making, the film and just and watch it for what it is. And that, I think I'm still processing a lot of that imagery, but it is an interesting thing to think about how, the film in some sense is about the white gaze. And I'm observing how others observe from my own perspective. So there's a lot of layers there. I'm curious what is the looking like for you?
It's interesting because I kept going back to this. There's this particular Glen My Gone image, which is very well known, and it features one of the images featured in your documentary, but it removes the body. It removes the person who has been lynched, and you only see the white faces. And I keep thinking about that image because there's some moments where I feel like I must witness, that I have a responsibility to witness the horror visited on people. And there's some moments in which I feel like people deserve the privacy of not being on display. And I find that I am then looking very closely at the images, like what are the facial expressions of the white people in the crowd? Where are the children?
Yeah.
And where are the families?
Right.
So that I feel like my looking has also evolved, so that I'm also thinking about seeing the image and understanding that who this was to see, like this was meant for a white viewer. And then in what ways do I subvert my own looking so I'm not participating in the same way? And for me, a lot of that is it's a dualness, that Du Bois double consciousness. It's both seeing the image, extending compassion and respect and love and care to this person who has been brutalized, this human person who's been brutalized, and then at the same time looking very carefully at all of those faces, because as you said earlier, right, those are folks' grandparents, right? Carolyn Bryant, who accused Emmett Till of whistling at her, which she later admitted was not true, is still alive and is in her early 80s.
Mm.
So really there's a way in which black and white photography, talking about time, gives us the sense that it was so long ago, right? And it may not actually be as long ago as we imagine. So I think that's some of the way I think about how my looking evolves. And I feel a deep responsibility to witness, but have that witnessing be restorative and thoughtful.
Yeah, it's something that I certainly thought a lot about and struggled with in making the film, right? Because I felt also, I didn't want to take sort of the artistic license that maybe a Glen My Gone or a Carrie James Marshall might, where they've, actually manipulated the imagery. I felt as a documentary filmmaker that it was important for me to include the imagery in its entirety, but that isn't because I'm trying to show the audience what is the frame that was taken and why was that frame taken in the way that it's taken. But at the same time, it was important to, I think, do what you're doing, which is, or what you're explaining, which is then redirect the viewer's eye, right? And so sometimes what that involved then was, rather than allowing the body to dominate the frame, to really focus in on those onlookers and their expressions. So I think the film is playing with both of those things, right? And both, not sanitizing, showing what there is for people to understand really what this is, but also not hanging on to that image any longer than is necessary to then make that point. And that also using images in such a way that they are constantly furthering the story or making a new point, as opposed to lingering on them. And so that was always the thinking behind those kinds of creative and editorial decisions.
And it feels so compelling that it is the image and then the back of the postcard where someone has written a message feels so compelling to me, because it really grounds this as this was an object that traveled and moved, and that also someone wrote on it. It's not anonymous. And there's a certain way in which the actual taking an image of a lynching is an anonymizing, because in many of these cases, the Black people's bodies have been literally torn asunder, literally torn asunder. And there's an erasure of the self that happens. And so there's an anonymizing that happens, but then you see how white people are not being anonymous at all.
Right.
Right. Here's my name. Here's the address. Did you miss me? Because if you did, I put a star over my head. So like the real freedom of embracing this level of cruelty and anonymizing of other people. And I think I'd be remiss, because for me, there's, as a scholar who looks at both photography and race and disability, I think part of what the photographs, even, as we talked about evolving of looking, was always very difficult for me, but core to lynching wasn't also a disabling of the body, right? Like it wasn't but it wasn't simply a murder or lynching that people were dismembered, right? Intentionally. And so thinking about that as a deep connection between race and disability, right? And the way that Black people's bodies are treated, or how violence is visited upon them. And this film captures that, and then captures how that's used by people.
Yeah, they were not just celebrations for the white people that attended and souvenirs, they were also messages to the Black community, right? Warnings of, this is what will happen to you if you step out of place. This will happen to you if you look at a person this way, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that comes to mind while you're speaking is just the capitalistic nature of the professional photographers who are capturing the images. and the ways in which they, in some cases, are signing their name to that print, right? And they're monetizing, this photograph and selling it like, any other postcard, which, by the way, postcard at the height, of these lynching postcards are taking off in the United States as well. So just the idea of these ways of communicating with people has taken off and is dovetailing. I think with lynching photography is also just interesting to think about, and interesting to think about just the different popular ways of communicating, of course, social media being one today. So you have, on the one hand, both these professional photographers who are making money off of these events, and often, the government being complicit with them. And then you also have your amateur photographers, who now have their own lightweight cameras and are there, taking part in the scene as well. It's really interesting.
It's very layered. I know that, I watched a few different times, and one of the things that I made a note for myself was around Black death as a literal currency. And the trafficking in Black death, that was a literal currency to be passed around. And I was really very struck by thinking about that, as what does it mean for that to travel in that way. And also I think it's the Gildersleeve image of Will Stanley, which becomes printed and used over and over and over again. And it's stamped on each one. And there's a period in time in which these images become collector's items. And there have been also some pretty well-known African Americans who in particular collected the lynching postcards, in part because what was happening was that people were now ashamed of having either been there or done this or had this collected, and so they were being destroyed. And so thinking about your film as archival in a number of different ways, both using archival principles, but also creating an archive.
It's a good point. I think around the, shortly, not that long after the lynching of actually Jesse Washington, NAACP investigators came to town, and that's when they pulled, the postcard from the store shelves, and they were then trying to play down, everything that had happened once they realized that, word had gotten out beyond the community. So you're right in that, there is a turning point, for many of these people, and that there was pride, but also an awareness that they should not be doing these things.
Christine, I just wanted to ask Christine, is there, someone asked, our friend Christopher Providence asked about how the Black newspapers at the time may have used these images.
So one of the things that, and you'll see, in the film, there are different clippings from The Crisis, for example, which was the magazine of the NAACP, and other newspapers as well. But one of the things that they're doing is they are recontextualizing those images, and they are redirecting the eyes of the readers and the viewers to talk about the white participants, for example. And there was a struggle, among activists at various points in our history about, whether they show these photographs, right? Like, what was there to be gained and what was there to be lost? And was this, do we want this out there in the first place? So these were questions that they were asking then, and I think that we're continuing to ask now today about, the videos and photographs that we're seeing of police murders. At a certain point, I think we do have to ask, how much more do we need to see in order to know that this is happening, right? Like, when is enough, and when do we need to do something about it? So I think it's an ongoing, question that we're always thinking about. Where I landed with this, film and sort of where I arrived is that, yes, people still need to see in order to believe. And it's and the reactions that I've seen, you know, just in screening the film, is that so many people continue to be shocked by the imagery, that they had not seen this, they can't imagine it. And it does take seeing it in order to really confront and reckon, you know, with that history. And certainly I admire the work that you all are doing, you know, around confronting this history and recognizing, you know, this very difficult past.
Do you think there, you talk about the repurposing of these images for, you know, by the anti-lynching movement, and I wonder if you can just describe, if you think, I mean, were they successful? And did that work? I mean, you know, we talk about the Wagner Costigan, you know, bill, and now here we are 90 years later.
Yes.
But what was it effective, at least in terms of guiding public opinion, do you think?
I do think so. I mean, the number, although, you know, many argue that, you know, the 1968 is sometimes this year that's used, but of course, in my own lifetime, you know, I remember James Byrd's lynching, for example. And of course, many of these other, you know, more recent murders that people consider lynching. So, I don't think that there's a clear ending, but certainly there is, you know, a turning point when the number of lynchings really does fall. And I think that that is a testament to the work of Black activists over, you know, a century and more of their activism. I think that, you know, it's remarkable that, you know, when the film was made, I had no idea that the, you know, federal anti-lynching legislation would be passed. Dr. Scott talks about in the film that, you know, there had been more than 200 attempts, and it just, you know, I didn't expect that a few months later that Congress would be ready to make that move. And so I think maybe we're at a moment now where people are ready to receive, you know, this history and really grapple with it.
Mm-hmm. I think these questions I see in the chat too, about this parallel between cell phone videos of Black death being parallel to postcards and their use, and I think also to the point that Terry Lee Freeman, the executive director of the Reginald Lewis, mentioned in the Q&A, is how do we explain to people that these images contribute to trauma and traumatizing Black people and affecting the daily lives of Black people. And I see that someone mentioned in the chat that she can no longer look at the killings of Black people. So I do, you know, I think a lot about this circulation myself, when there was a point at which I felt deeply resentful when you would be on Twitter and an image of George Floyd or Eric Garner would flash before you can even make the decision to see it. And the onslaught of Black death, or people would send the video to me and I'd be like, no, I know what's happening. I don't actually need to see this repeatedly. So thinking about trauma, and I think that what the film does is really to help us think about, this is a long-term trauma. And whereas white people may need to be reintroduced to it every generation, Black people do not. We have disappeared family members who or that racialized violence has continued. It may not always look like, for instance, lynching, but it may look like the violence of the Central Park Five going to jail for decades. It may look like the Jena Six. It may look like a whole slew of other things that are really racialized terror that contribute to trauma for Black folk. We're thinking about high blood pressure. Like there are conversations in the medical field talking about the direct correlation to this onslaught of trauma, and we need to think about that as part of racialized violence as well.
I'm thinking, and just listening to you say that, Dr. Mobley, I'm thinking of Cheryl and Eiffel saying that the memory of lynching is indelibly engraved on the psyche of Black people. I think that's something that we all need to remember.
And why do white people need to be reminded every generation or so, and then reshocked every generation or so, right? There is a purpose to that forgetting. And it's interesting because you get postcards as souvenirs. So in French, souvenir is literally about how to remember, right? And so really thinking about the idea of a souvenir, really speaking to how whiteness both remembers itself and circulates the memory of its power.
Christine, I want to ask you, we're getting late on time, I'm afraid, but I did want to ask you, what do you think people should carry from this film to help them understand this reckoning that we're in the midst of? How does this speak to us in the 21st century? Or how do you want it to? That's a different question.
Yes. Well, I certainly, I hope that it doesn't. And I thought about this quite a bit because of the way in which, we've been bombarded by the news of so many Black murders. So I did actually think about if and how this film might actually bring up, re-traumatize people in that sense. But I hope, it's a reminder to all audiences of actually the power of activism, really. And that, for as long as Black people have been in this country, they have been fighting. We have been fighting. So that is actually something that's really, I hope that people will keep in their mind as they watch the film and think about the film and not see African Americans solely as victims, but also as agents of change. So that's something that I think all of us can take away from the film. And I hope that, people will be more willing to talk about this history openly and grapple with it, right? If we are to move forward as a country.
Great. Dr. Mobley, any final words before we go?
I encourage everyone to take good care of themselves, but especially and particularly Black people, and especially and particularly Black women, because we are in a moment where there is so much happening and so many stressors around race and looking and witnessing. And so many of us are called to witness over and over and over again. And it's critical and important, and it takes a toll. So I think think about Audre Lorde's quote, self-care, or that she doesn't say self-care, she actually says care of the self is not indulgence. It is a form of political warfare, to thinking about your own self-preservation as a resistance, which I think is what is in the film, is there are forms of resistance and the power of what it means to look closely, really reflect.
Thank you so much. And thank you both so much for joining us tonight. This has been an incredible experience for me. And I think for everyone who's viewed it, I would say we should probably do this again at some point, because it was just a wonderful conversation. I apologize to people whose questions we were unable to get to. If anything can be answered offline, I will attempt to get that done. I did want to mention right before we go, however, I did want to remind people that in Maryland, we are the only state that has a Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a unique opportunity for this state, and I want to encourage everyone to pay attention to what's going on. The hearings, we've had one hearing so far. I believe the next one is going to be in June here in Baltimore County, but the rest of these hearings are going to be, public hearings are going to be happening throughout the year, and I would really encourage people to pay attention, because this is an unusual opportunity, and we finally have a chance to do something meaningful in the Truth and Reconciliation quest. So thank you again, both of you, so much, and thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thank you.